Hey team, here we are, another lecture. And you finished up the fungi, which is cool. And now we've come full circle. If you remember when we started this class, we began in the kingdom Plantae, right? We were talking about plant tissues and all that. Well, now we've come back to the plant kingdom and now we're doing taxonomy and life cycles. So this PowerPoint, is actually the last PowerPoint I think that we'll do. We break up the plant kingdom. This first unit that goes with the fungi includes the spore plants. And then the last unit includes the seed plants. So it's right here. And I'll just go ahead and tell you this one that says plant evolution and morphology. This is something I downloaded from the internet and it's just supplemental information. So this is the one you want. It says Kingdom Plantae PowerPoint. If we open that up, we can begin our discussion of this the plant kingdom as it relates to taxonomy, etc. Okay. So what about the plant kingdom? Well, unlike some of those other kingdoms, you already know a lot about plants, right? They are eukaryotic, photosynthetic, multicellular organisms, and they contain chlorophyll A and B. This is one thing, chlorophyll B is something that kind of separates them out from some of the algae. So we consider, organisms that have both these types of chlorophyll to be a little more advanced. We do believe phylogenetically that from the algae came the first land plants, which would be the bryophytes, and we'll learn all about the bryophyta or the mosses. Okay. So for the test that's coming up, test 4, this is the taxonomy that you're responsible for. These are the spore plants. And so all plants can be divided up into spore or seed plants. And what's interesting is that, we believe the more primitive plants make spores and the more advanced or highly evolved plants make seeds. We want to be careful about using primitive and advanced to mean something about survival or the ability to survive, because that's not what it means. When we use these terms, really we're talking more about evolutionarily speaking, more primitive or more advanced. Just because you're more advanced from an evolutionary standpoint doesn't necessarily mean you're better able to survive. So just very quickly, spore versus seed, what's the difference? The biggest difference is that a spore is a single cell, right? And so these organisms reproduce by using a single-celled propagule, you might think of it as. A seed is many cells. And a seed contains a little baby plant, which is an embryo. Okay, so you could see how, this might be considered to be a little less advanced. So the other thing about the spore plants is that they have flagellated sperm. And honestly, if you looked at the sperm of, let's say, a moss or a fern even, it would look all the world like Chlamydomonas. I mean, we see these similarities between Chlamydomonas and a sperm of a moss. So it's weird to think about plants having flagellated sperm, but in the case of the spore plants, they do. Everything you see on this list has flagellated sperm that swims to the egg. This is why many of these organisms or really all of them are dependent on water. Now, granted, it can be a microscopic film of water after a rain. It doesn't have to be a river or a pond. Okay, so that's another thing about them. Now, if we draw a line, and this is important as well, if we draw a line right here, it turns out that these two groups, the Bryophyta and the Hepatophyta, the mosses and the liverworts, this is incorrect. That's not good. I need to fix that. These are just the mosses, not the mosses and the ferns. Sorry. These two groups are non-vascular. And these groups here are vascular. What are we saying? Well, we're talking about vascular tissue, right? So the mosses and liverworts are non-vascular, meaning they don't have xylem and phloem. What this limits about them is their size. They can't, what's the tallest moss you ever saw? You know, it's about yay big, right? So what is limited if you don't have vascular tissue is quite literally the how tall you can be, the size that you can be. These are vascular plants. Now, you know, the biggest ferns we have around here aren't really all that impressive, but there are tree ferns that are 20 or 30 feet tall if you go to the tropics. And what we know about these other groups, the Lycophyta and the Splenophyta, is along with the ferns, there were forests of these organisms that were gigantic. And this is the coal that we burn from the Carboniferous period, came from the prehistoric lycopodiums and horsetails and ferns. And so at one time, these dominated the earth when the earth was warm and wet, these groups of organisms. So that gives you a little bit of insight. Again, I apologize for this. I need to fix that because that's very incorrect to say mosses and ferns for the Bryophyta. So what do we have? We have the Bryophyta. Phyta means leaf, and so Bryophyta are the mosses. Hepato means liver. We'll talk about this name liverwort. Lycophyta are the lycopodiums. Splenophyta, the horsetails, and Pterophyta, the ferns. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to go through and we want to look at pictures of these things and know what they look like. And then we also want to understand something about their life cycle. Okay. There's a lot of terminology associated with the life cycle of plants. It's terms that you haven't necessarily seen before. And so that's one of the things you might want to keep a running list of vocabulary terms that just deal with life cycles. Okay. So what about the mosses? Well, if you will, for just a second, in order to have a sense of the life cycle, and you know, most of you could go outside and you could find a moss, right? That wouldn't be an issue. Here's the thing. Think back to the ova life cycle for just a second so that we can understand this picture that we're looking at here, okay? If you think back to the ova life cycle, if you recall, ova exhibited a type of life cycle which we refer to as alternation of generations, right? And if you recall about ova, the two generations, the sporophyte and the gametophyte, looked exactly the same. You couldn't tell them apart. So you couldn't tell if you were looking at a sporophyte or a gametophyte unless you literally counted the chromosomes. Remember, the gametophyte generation is haploid and the sporophyte generation is diploid. Well, I'm here to tell you all plants exhibit alternation of generations. What we see over time from the mosses, which are considered to be the most primitive plants, through the vascular plants and the flowering plants of the Magnolia phyta, is a gradual reduction in the size of the gametophyte generation and a gradual sort of largening, I'm making words up. What we see is a smaller gametophyte generation and a larger sporophyte generation over time. Now, we don't see that with the mosses, the most primitive plants. So here's the thing. The green mosses are haploid or gametophyte dominant. And what I mean by that is the green leafy part of a moss plant is the gametophyte. It's 1N, it's haploid, okay? You've maybe noticed if you wander around in the woods, these little things that grow up And I'm going to outline one here. These little things that grow up and out of the gametophytes. Oh, they're putting speed humps on my road, y'all. I don't know if you can hear the beeping. Finally, we get some speed bumps. Otherwise, people go 60 miles an hour down my residential road. Okay, so this is the sporophyte. And the wacky thing about mosses is that the gametophyte and the sporophyte are attached to one another. And this is the only place we're going to see this. In other organisms, for example, in Ulva, the gametophyte and the sporophyte were separate free-living things. So the mosses and the liverworts have the same life cycle. They're allied together. And the weird thing about them is that you have this green leafy gametophyte that grows vegetatively, and then eventually sexual reproduction occurs, and you get a sporophyte growing up out of a gametophyte. So down here is a little baby gametophyte, and up here is the sporophyte, and they're permanently attached. In fact, the sporophyte generation, the diploid generation, is somewhat parasitic on the gametophyte, if you think about it. Okay, so that kind of explains the mosses, and we'll touch a little more on the life cycle in just a second. Now, liverworts, you may not be familiar with them. They're rather strange looking organisms. And the name liverwort or Hepatophyta comes from a time when we had this thing called the doctrine of signatures. And this is in the 1800s. Humans in the 1800s were very anthropomorphic, meaning everything was about humans. It's all about us, right? And so they would look at a plant, for example, and see how it seemed to relate to humans in terms of human organs. And so the thing about the liverworts is they branch like this when they grow. You can see the lobes that form right here. And someone said, oh, well, it's lobed like the human liver. And so they called it a liverwort. But they took it a step further and they said, well, since it's lobed like a human liver, it resembles a human liver, it's a tonic for that organ. And so, you know, if you're having some hepatitis, you might want to just have a cup or two of liverwort tea, you know, and that will cure your hepatitis. Now, there's no scientific basis for the doctrine of signatures. It was just a kind of a wacky idea. Okay, so I can't tell you if you have hepatitis, you might want to try some liverwort to treat your hepatitis. Okay. So these are very primitive, you know, plant members of the plant kingdom. They have a similar life cycle to the mosses, and so the mosses and the liverworts are often grouped together. Where are you going to find these liverworts? They typically grow in wet areas on rocks, usually on rocks, in streams or stream adjacent to streams. It has to be a really wet spot. This particular one is probably the most common one we have around here, and it's very aromatic, so it's interesting to give it a sniff, you might say. Okay, so at this point, we're going to do a little chalk and talk. I want to go back one. I can't see my screen, unfortunately. It's kind of wacky. Oh, that's interesting. If I right click, well, let's see. We won't worry about doing that. Let me escape out of this. Actually, we will go back for just a second. So again, just to reiterate, because we're about to draw this, here's the gametophyte generation, and here's the sporophyte generation. Okay. The moss life cycle, we're going to kind of go through it and talk about it. And it'll be good because the fern life cycle is going to be very similar. And so it's nice to hear these terms more than once. And that's one of my incentives for doing this. The fern life cycle is going to be the one we're really going to want to focus on. It's really an interesting life cycle. So let me pull up a whiteboard here. Oh, there's mycorrhizae. And let's talk about it. Let's think about these mosses and how they reproduce sexually. Okay. So what you have, believe it or not, is a gametophyte generation. And you might as well just get it in your head. The gametophyte generation is always haploid, always, 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 always haploid. Okay. You're going to see this in every plant life cycle that we do. Believe it or not, when you look at an individual moss plant, it can be a boy moss plant or a girl moss plant. They're a little difficult to tell apart. Here's our little gametophyte, and we'll let this be a boy. And we'll draw another one down here. And we'll let this be a girl. Okay. Now, we're already haploid. So when you think about the processes that occur, if you're already haploid, what's going to happen first is fusion, right? Because you got to get to diploid, and then you got to get back to haploid. So, you know, these gametophytes, always remember the gametophyte makes the gamete, right? What's the male gamete? A sperm. And so in the top of this plant right here, these little structures called antheridia will form. Antheridia with sperm. And in the top of the female, and I'll do some different colors in a second, we have these little structures called archegonia with egg. Now, let me change the color here so you can see this. Okay, here's all of our little sperm inside of an antheridia. In the archegonia, there's a single egg in each one. There can be 2 or 3 archegonia in a female gametophyte, but each archegonia just has a single egg. Okay, well, now we have sperm and we have egg. So what can we do? Well, we can do fusion, right? And so literally what fusion looks like is these little sperm are flagellated and they're released and off they go and they swim in the water and they're swimming around, and one of them finds the neck of the archegonia and it swims down in there. And what you then get is fusion. Okay, so let me draw. Now this is going to be the female. I'll draw her a little bigger. And there's her archegonia. And now, what's this cell? The first cell of the next generation is the zygote, which is diploid. Okay, this occurred from the fusion of the sperm and the egg. So now we have this one diploid cell in the archegonia attached to all of this haploid female gametophyte. Well, that zygote does mitosis times many to form the sporophyte generation. And now here's where things get really interesting. Here's the gametophyte growing up out of the gametophyte, believe it or not, is this structure that we call the sporophyte. Now think about the ploidy of everything, right? The sporophyte is diploid, right? Because it's the product of mitosis from this one diploid zygote. And so the diploid zygote did mitosis over and over to form the sporophyte. What does the sporophyte consist of? It consists of this stalk and this capsule. And inside the capsule are diploid cells, which we're going to call spore mother cells. And again, you're going to see these same terms over and over. They got to be 2N. We haven't done meiosis yet. What about the rest of this stuff? Well, the rest of this stuff is the gametophyte, which is 1N. Okay. Well, how do we get back to haploid? These spore mother cells have to do meiosis, right? Meiosis occurs in the capsule. And think about it now. I'm just going to draw the capsule here. every one of those cells that does meiosis makes 4 spores. Okay. And so these are then released. This thing kind of opens up and out they come. And we have these little individual spores, which are haploid. They're the products of meiosis. Okay. And then there's this interesting little stage when the spores germinate, and they make these little structures. When the spores germinate, they start to grow like this. And eventually they start to branch a little bit. And what they're doing is they're going to grow, and this is all mitosis, right? They're going to grow into the new moss plant over here. But there's this stage when they're germinating, and we call these protonema, Protonema, I think. Protonema. And the moss protonema, when they're first germinating and growing, look all the world like a darn green algae. They look like Spirogyra, you know, or nostoc, or one of those other green algae, not nostoc, that's a cyanobacteria, but they look a lot like Spirogyra. So, you know, it's kind of a holdback to the fact that the mosses likely evolved and colonized land from filamentous or phthalate green algae. So now we're back where we started. So gametophyte generation makes the gametes, sperm and eggs, fusion occurs, the zygote does mitosis to form the sporophyte generation, which is permanently attached to the gametophyte. Spore mother cells in the capsule of the sporophyte do meiosis to make the spores, which then germinate. We're back to haploid, and we've completed our life cycle. So I hope that makes sense to you. These terms, spore mother cell, antheridia, archegonia, you're going to see these terms again. The one term you won't see again is protonema. This is only for mosses and liverworts. Why are liverworts allied with the mosses? Because their life cycle is literally exactly the same. There's no difference. It's just that they're morphologically, they look different. And that's probably why they've been put in a different group. Okay. So that's cool. So the other life cycle that we're going to do, and we'll probably get through it today, we'll see, is the fern life cycle. The rest of these groups, so now the lycophyte and the splenophyte are allied with the ferns, and so we want to look at those. Let me make this jumbo just for the heck of it. Okay, so now we're at the ferns, and we'll do the life cycle at the very end. But here again, we have, now here's the thing. After the liverworts, after the non-vascular plants, we all of a sudden become sporophyte dominant. So I know it's confusing, but the green leafy part of a moss is a gametophyte. The green leafy part of a fern is a sporophyte. And so, like I said, we're going to see a gradual reduction in the size of the gametophyte generation and an increase in the size of the sporophyte generation from the mosses all the way through the flowering plants. Okay, so now what I'm telling you is now this green leafy part of the plant is the sporophyte, not the gametophyte. It's easy to mix that up. Now these cells are diploid. Same thing here, sporophyte. So now our life cycle gets flipped around because we got to do meiosis first, right? Because we're diploid, and so the sporophyte makes the spores. And what we're going to see is that these things here are the reproductive structures of the sporophyte. This is where the spores are going to be made. And there's lots of different variations of how that can happen. But I'm going to go ahead and give you a term. when they're on the back side of the leaf like this, we call them sori, S-O-R-I, or sorus is singular. So there's a new word for you. Some terminology for the fern. The leaves are often called fronds, F-R-O-N-D. Okay, so there's a frond, which is a leaf of a fern. And then, you know, there's all different scenarios of how they make their spores. This is cinnamon fern, and it makes these fertile leaves. These, believe it or not, are highly modified leaves, which are making sporangia. Others, like this one, make their spores on the backs of vegetative leaves. Okay. So this is a new word, sorus or sori, plural, is an important one. Okay. As far as their ecology and life cycle go, you know, like I said, there are tree ferns. There are very large ferns in the tropics that can get 20 or 30 feet tall, that can have enormous leaves. For the most part, ferns grow in wet and warm climates, but, you know, they can also be temperate. Most are perennial. There are a few annual ferns, which seems strange, but there are some. In terms of their relevance to humans, they've been used as food in certain parts of the world. The fern fiddlehead, the young leaf of a fern, they're always rolled up like this. When they, oh, that's a terrible drawing, sorry. You've probably seen them, and we can go online and look at some of these, but the rolled up leaves are called fiddleheads. And they're used as food. There's been some concern and some links between the fiddleheads and stomach cancer, gastrointestinal cancers. And so you would want to eat them sparingly. These is prominent in cultures where that's about the only green leafy thing there is to eat. Far north, you know, boreal habitats like Alaska, northern Canada. Okay. So there's that. And again, we will come back to the life cycle of the ferns here in just a second. But let's see what their allies look like. Oh, well, here's the life cycle, so we might as well go ahead and do it. And then we'll look at their allies. So we should be able to finish the fern life cycle as well as the allies. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. I'm going to go back to my drawing board in a second, but let's look. You know, it starts out with sporophyte generation, making spores, and you can see here is a sorus, and it consists of this little covering in most cases called an indusium. And here's the crazy thing, y'all. Here's the sporophyte, here's the gametophyte, and this gametophyte is about probably 10 times its actual size in real life. And so the crazy thing is that the gametophyte generation, like I said, is greatly reduced. It's a tiny little thing. And so we'll draw it to scale when we do our drawing. Okay, so this is showing the life cycle in detail. It probably doesn't make much sense until we walk through it. So let's do that. Okay, oops. Let me get out of there. Go back to my drawing board. And let's get rid of the moss. And let's look at the ferns. So we're still going to do alternation of generations. That hasn't changed. Here's the thing, though. Like I said, now, let me draw a fiddlehead there. Whoop. And let me draw a rootstock. Let me draw the rootstock in brown. So ferns are typically perennialized by a woody rootstock or rhizome. We talked about rhizomes before. Rhizome's an underground stem, right? Which is a perennial structure. Think about ginger as a rhizome. So there's the rhizome, which keeps it alive through the winter or through the off season. There's a fiddlehead. Okay, and then this is the frond. So we start our life cycle with the sporophyte generation, which is 2N, always. Sporophytes always diploid. And so what we're going to do first then is meiosis, because we're diploid, we need to get to haploid. on the backs of the leaves will be these little sori. There's a single sorus. And so if we take one of those and we blow it up a little bigger, and we look at it sort of not down on it, but from a side view, we're going to see it consists of this little covering. Not all sori have this covering, but most do. I'm going to do some different colors here just for the heck of it. What's the structure that makes spores? A sporangia, right? So this is a sporangium. Okay, and we're going to blow one of those up in a second. And then this thing up here is the indusium. Indusium is like a covering over the sporangia. And there are lots of different scenarios. The more primitive ferns, the edge of the leaf right here will roll in and cover the sporangia. Some ferns don't have an indusium at all, and the sporangia are just in clusters, as we saw in that slide, actually. And we'll look at some different scenarios for ones that do have an indusium. But an indusium is like a little umbrella that covers the sporangia. And of course, inside the sporangia, there are cells. So now if we blow up one of these sporangia, this is kind of cool to do. What we see is, it looks like this. It's got this little mohawk like this. And the little mohawk is called the annulus. And the annulus, these annular cells, as they're called, are important in the dehiscence, or the shedding of the spores. Inside this stage, we haven't done meiosis yet, so they're not spores. They're in fact spore mother cells. And we're still diploid. Everything is diploid at this stage. But you know what's going to happen, right? Spore mother cells are going to do meiosis. And there's a term that I forgot to give you before, which I should have. Let me draw this in here. It applies also to the mosses. And if you think about it, for a hot minute, these products of meiosis, these spores are stuck together. And there's 4 of them, but when I draw them, I'm only showing 3 because the 4th one would be on the backside and you wouldn't really see it. Okay, so we call these tetrads of spores. Okay, and then these tetrads are going to come apart. What literally happens is these things are dependent on moisture. As the annulus gets wet, it starts to pull back and it literally tears the sporangia open and out come the spores. But now we have these haploid spores. They're the products of meiosis. There's our meiosis of the spore mother cells. Now let me just draw one spore. The tetrads come apart and we're going to say, okay, here's one spore. Okay, and that one spore does mitosis times many to make the gametophyte generation, which we must do in green because it is green. And I'm going to draw it big. It's a little heart-shaped structure. In real life, it's about that big. It's tiny. It's a quarter of your pinky nail at the most. And so it's crazy to think that the entire life cycle of this organism really hinges upon this little gametophyte. This is the gametophyte generation. And it's 1N, right? It's haploid. It's the product of meiosis, of one of these spores. Okay, it's many thousands of cells, but yet it's much smaller. I mean, think about in ova, the gametophyte and sporophyte were exactly the same size, or you couldn't even tell them apart. In the mosses, the gametophyte was dominant, but now the sporophyte is dominant vegetatively, and the gametophyte is reduced in size. Well, the other thing about the gametophyte is it's bisexual. And when we use the term bisexual, when we're talking about plants, we mean it actually makes both sperm and eggs. And so up here you have archegonia with eggs. And down here you have antheridia with sperm. Make the sperm a different color just for fun. And let's label this. These are Antheridia. So you see all the names are the same. One end sperm, and then these are Archegonia with eggs. Okay, and now here's a weird thing though. A weird thing is it would be a little strange for the sperm to fertilize its own egg, right? This is an interesting idea. And we talked about this with Volvox, I think, but the whole point of sexual reproduction and fusing a sperm and an egg is to create genetic variability. Well, if you have sex with yourself, you're not getting a lot of genetic variability. So in order to solve this problem, what usually happens is there's a temporal separation between the sperm and the egg maturity, temporal meaning time. And so the idea is that the sperm mature first and they're released into the environment. Off they go, swimming away, looking for an egg at in another gametophyte that's a little further along. So once the sperm are gone, then the eggs become viable, and you have fertilization can occur. So the idea is sperm from some other gametophyte are going to get these eggs. But once fertilization occurs, once we'll show one of these little sperm swimming. Oops, what have I done? Yeah, we'll show one of these little sperms swimming down the neck and fertilizing one of the eggs. And so our next picture might look like this. We're going to have a zygote now. Here's our gametophyte. And I'm just going to draw one. I'll just draw one Archegonia here. And now we're going to draw a zygote in there because fertilization has occurred. Fusion, this is fusion, right? Let's write the word fusion in there. It's a process that's occurring here. And now we have, before I did the zygote in black, let's do it in black. Boy, it's noisy out there. I wonder if y'all can hear that. Now we're back to diploid. And I'm going to draw one more picture, and this is my favorite picture. This is, check this out. How do we get a new sporophyte from the zygote? Well, here's the gametophyte, right? And this zygote does mitosis times many. To make a new sporophyte. But there's this short little period of time where you have the gametophyte is still there, and growing out of the gametophyte where this zygote was is a little baby sporophyte. Oh, it's so cute. I wish I could show it to you in real life. We would get to see it in real life if we were in class. So there's this one little moment where you have the sporophyte, the new baby sporophyte, which is diploid, and you still have the gametophyte attached. And, at this point, the gametophyte just kind of withers away and it's gone. And now we have a new sporophyte. Wacky life cycle, alternation of generations, don't forget. Sporophyte, gametophyte, right? Sporophyte made the spores, gametophyte made the gametes, okay? This is a really cool life cycle. And again, I wish I could show you actual live gametophyte. We usually are able to find them in the greenhouse. But let's look at some pictures now, just for fun, just so that we can see what this stuff looks like. Now, if we go back, this life cycle should make sense. You can see the sori with their little inducium and their sporangia. This isn't the greatest image in the world. There's the annulus. Okay, there's the gametophyte. Let's look at some actual gametophytes, some real life gametophytes. Here's one labeled, it says. Let's see what we get. Let's look at actual pictures of them. I want to see a picture of one. Here's a great one. I always show this one in my class. See if we can get it to be big. Maybe not. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. So this is cool. You know, you can see, again, this is probably at 10x or maybe even 25x. You can see the Archegonia, the Antheridia. The rhizoids are these little root-like structures which mount this thing to the soil. To see one in real life in nature is really difficult. You got to crawl around on your hands and knees looking for it, which is kind of wacky. Let's try fern gametophyte with sporophyte, with young sporophyte. That's what I want to show you. This is the cutest little thing in the whole world. Look at this, y'all. Look how cute. Let's see if we can get that one to come up. Come on, baby. Pop up for me. Oh, well. Maybe not. It used to be you could just look at anything you wanted online, but not anymore, you know. You end up getting lots of pop-ups and such. Let's see. Well, I mean, you can see it here, obviously. Here it is. Pretty good picture. Let's see if we can get one to pop up, though. I want to find one that's really cute. This one's pretty cute. See if we can make it pop up. Look, there's some liverworts. That's nice. Here's liverworts reproducing. There's the sporophyte of a liverwort. So this is actually good. We're seeing some different things. A lot of stuff on the site here. Having to scroll through all of the other stuff. I like the site though, it's good. Okay, here we go. Now we're getting warm. Oh, there's a tree fern, check that out. See how big that is? Tree fern in California. Here's some sori on the back of a leaf. It's interesting, y'all, you know, I get called especially in the fall, because that's when the sori are really prevalent. People call me and they're like, there's these bugs or bug eggs on the backside of my fern leaf. I'm like, no, they're actually not bug eggs. Oh yeah, they're bug eggs, or they're little bugs. They're not moving, but there's little bugs. Well, no, they're actually just clusters of open sporangia. Now check this out. This is really nice. You can see the indusium here with the sporangia underneath. Here's a microscopic view of it. You know, check this out. This is the leaf. Here's the underside of the leaf. And you can see there's the annulus. You can see the annulus of the sporangia. This is great. Great. I'm so glad we clicked on this. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Well, if I do that, I can't scroll. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but look at those annular cells with the spore mother cells or spores inside. We don't know for sure. And there's the gametophyte. Beautiful. I should save this site here. This is a great site. And that's what I wanted to show you. See the gametophyte with the little baby sporophyte growing out of it. Isn't that beautiful? Okay. All right. Awesome, y'all. So what about the rest of the allies, things that are allies to the ferns? There is the Lycophyta, which are commonly called running cedar, running pine, or Lycopodium. Okay. And what are we looking at here? Well, you might be able to figure out what we're looking at. You know, here's the green leafy sporophyte, right? The gametophyte is going to be just like it was in the ferns, but the way that this thing makes its spores is through these little candle-like structures. And these are going to be sporangia in here. And we'll say with spores, will spores be 1N, and the sporophyte is 2N. And then, you know, why are the lycophytes allied with the ferns? Because they make that little heart-shaped gametophyte just like the ferns do. Same life cycle. That's the bottom line. Now, here's the crazy thing about the spores of lycopodiums. They're super flammable, like gunpowder flammable. And they used to use the old-timey flash photography. They used to gather the spores of lycopodiums And that's what was the flash on the flash photography back in the day. Isn't that wild? Okay. And then the last ones, oops, let me clear it. And then the last members, there are some other members, but the last ones that we're going to talk about are the Splenophyta, which are the horsetails. And you can see we don't so much have this really wild branch from, but you can see why they call them the horsetails, because they look like a horse's tail. It's very bushy. This is equisetum. I'm going to write that out. Equus means horse in Latin, right? And so where do you see these things growing? They look a little bit like bamboo. This is equisetum, Equisetum. It's the genus of the division Splenophyta, which are the horsetails. Here's the sporangia structure with its spores. It looks like the spores have pretty much been released out of this one. And you can see, if you saw this, the non-branching ones look a little like bamboo. You see these growing along rivers and wet areas. There's a bunch down on the French Broad. They've become actually popular as ornamentals as well. Okay. Here again, why are they allied with the ferns? Well, they're allied with the ferns because they have the same life cycle. Okay. These are commonly also called scouring rushes. And they're called that because they have this strange thing that they do where they take up silica or sand from the soil. And when they do that, they embed it in their cell walls, and it's very abrasive. You can literally take a piece of this and file your fingernails with it. And the story is that the Amerindians, you would take handfuls of these and use them to scour their pottery with, because they were just like a Brillo pad almost. Okay. So that is, oops, that is the end of the unit, okay? And I'm not going to show you the next slide because the next slide goes into the, actually, let me make sure that there's not another slide just to be sure. Okay, good. So this is not on test 4. This is where we're going for test 5 with this other taxonomy. Okay, so be aware, test 4 information ends with the with this slide here, okay, the Splenophyta. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Go back over those life cycles. Make sure you understand the terminology. There's a bunch of new words: sorus, indusium, annulus, spore mother cell, antheridia, archegonia, gametophyte. We've already talked about gametophyte, but you get the idea. There's a bunch of words, so please take the time to learn them, and you'll be in good shape. Okay. I hope you had a wonderful time listening to this lecture, and I will see you next time.